Chapter 27. Karis only fell a few feet through the floor before she hit something soft. Her left foot sank to the knee while the rest of her body continued falling into the basement. The sticky whatever it was held her leg as she fell. So she swung upside down, and the rest of her slapped into the side of something like a great red egg, a thin crust over gooey innards. She smacked into it, broke the side, and splatted into red Luxon. Then her fall pulled her free, and she fell onto a stone floor. As she had been trained, she flung her right hand down, hard. The shock of slapping the floor hurt her hand. It always hurt. But that slap took the pressure off more vulnerable areas of her body and allowed her to guide the last part of her fall. She rolled instead of landing on her head. In a moment she popped back up to her feet and pulled the thin-hilted Atigan from her pack. There was no light in the chamber except what spilled down through the hole she'd made in the ceiling. Chunks of wood were still falling into the hole. The great red egg shone in the sudden light. Settling smoke, stirred by Karis's fall, climbed into the shaft of light surrounding the egg. The entire room, perhaps 20 paces by 30, stank of smoke and burnt red Luxon, which was odd because red Luxon usually burned perfectly cleanly. For that matter, every surface illuminated in the weak light appeared to be blackened Luxon as well. But the red egg took all of Karis's attention. At least 7 feet tall, it was seared perfectly black, except where Karis had broken it. Red Luxon now oozed out of that wound like tar. A half-dozen tubes snaked away from the egg in every direction, disappearing into the ceiling, each also blackened. The seared corpses of a dozen of King Garadul's soldiers lay about the room. "What in the hell?" Karis murmured. She lifted her sword to crack the egg open. The egg exploded before she could touch it. A great section of the front flew into her, the blackened shell shattering over her barely raised left arm, her chest, stomach, and legs. Caught in mid-step, she was thrown off balance. She stumbled and felt more than saw a form shooting backward out of the egg, even as the shell splattered over her. Instead of trying to catch herself, Karis flung herself into the fall. She rolled forward, tucking her Atigan in so she didn't skewer herself, and attacked. There was no hesitation. Iron Fist had pounded that lesson into Karis for years. When you were attacked, you counterattack instantly. The speed of that strike was often the only advantage you had, especially if you were small, especially if you were a woman, especially if you weren't wearing your spectacles and the other drafter was. Karis's attacker had backed all the way up to the wall. He stood with living coils of red Luxon like giant knots around his hands. Karis knew that construction. If you knew what you were doing, you could hold extra open Luxon outside your body. These knots of open Luxon could be formed into anything you wanted, and held on your hands. You could actually fling them however you needed. The man stood like a trained fighter, too, left side toward Karis, left hand up to block, but still with some springiness to throw out an attack. Right hand higher and pulled back, right knee bent deeply, holding most of his weight. Even with Karis's speed with drafting, and the amount of red Luxon here to reflect red light to her eyes, it still took some time to ready an attack, and he had the drop on her. Her only hope was to close the distance between them before he killed her. His left hand flicked out, right to left, low. Red Luxon glommed on the floor to slow her. She was expecting it, and she stutter-stepped over the sticky patches. His right hand snapped forward in 3 sharp jerks. 3 balls, each the size of a fist, whipped out right to left. Karis dodged the first and second, but the third caught her as she had to stutter-step again to miss another sticky patch on the floor. It thumped hard into the ribs on her left side and then splattered. She rolled with it, spun into range, and slashed with the Atigan. The red drafter met her descending sword with layer after layer of red Luxon. Held Luxon, even Red Luxon, could gain a certain degree of rigidity from the drafter's will, and more from being woven, but Red Luxon could never stop steel. It's like pitting water against a sword. But this wasn't just a bit of held Red Luxon. It wasn't like slapping a sword into still water. It was like standing below a dam when they opened the floodgates. It was only water, but the speed and volume of it would blow a man off his feet. Likewise, the Red Luxon hitting Karis slowed her more, and finally brought her to a complete halt. The Red Drafter's face paled as the Luxon drained out of him. Next, his neck and chest went back to their natural hue as the torrent continued. Then his muscular shoulders, the Luxon being bleached out of his body from eyes to extremities. They both realized he was running out of Luxon at the same time. Karis broke off her attack at the same time he did. She feinted to his right, expecting to meet more Red Luxon, and set up a killing blow. Instead, her sword clanged against something hard, but she didn't see any other sword. He couldn't have drawn one without her seeing it, not even in this darkness. Not hesitating, she lifted the Atigan and brought it down toward his head. It clanged and stopped as he lifted his hands in a V. He shoved her hard backward and followed, keeping close. The shafts of light piercing the gloom of the room illuminated his hands, and what he was holding as he shouted, "Enough, damn you! Stop for 1 second!" The drafter held a pistol in each hand. Crossed, their barrels holding Karis's Atigan prisoner between them. His right pistol stared at her right eye, his left at her left eye. Karis had her other knives and the bichwa, of course, but there was no way she could draw any of them before he could pull a trigger. The pistols staring at her were of Elysian design. The Elysian renunciation of magic usually meant their mundane tools were the best. With pistols, however, it was still dicey. This drafter had wheel-lock pistols. They negated the need to keep a fuse burning, but the flints failed to ignite the black powder at least one time in 4. Unfortunately, both pistols were double-barreled, and all 4 hammers were raised. Karis tried to do the figures. Was it one time in 16 or one time in 256 that all 4 shots would fail? Her heart despaired. She wasn't going to gamble on those odds, not even 1 in 16. So, talking then. "What do you draft?" the man demanded, his voice strained. "I don't know what you're talking about." "What do you draft?" he screamed. He flung her Atigan aside and put one pistol directly against her forehead. It was too dark for him to see her irises, but he was going to figure out soon anyway. So Karis said, "Green. Green and red." "Then draft a ladder and get out. Now." Another time, Karis might have been irked that she obeyed so promptly, but her spectacles were on her face in an instant, and she turned toward the light. Everything in this chamber was covered with either open Red Luxon or blackened, seared, closed Red Luxon. Finally, she found an ironwood beam up in the temple that reflected a pure enough white light to allow her to draft a good solid green. Even as her body filled with green, she saw why the drafter was so urgent. The chamber was filled with Red Luxon. She shouldn't have put it together so slowly. There were 2 entrances to the room, and the dead soldiers were seared, but not roasted to death. And the Red Luxon had remained, coating everything rather than burning as it should have. And it still remained. The room was full of Red Luxon, old and new. They were inside a powder keg. A burning pew fell over, spilling smoldering and flaming brands down the hole. One tottered on the edge, promising death. Karis ran forward, throwing down green Luxon thick enough to stand on. She drafted what was effectively an impossibly narrow staircase, the steps only wide enough to hold her feet. only strong enough to hold her weight if she concentrated her will. But it only had to last for 2 seconds while she sprinted out. And it did. She stepped, fleet-footed as a hind, and vaulted, landing on the church floor. She felt a bit of the floor give way, to drop into the chamber below, as she rolled again, and kept running for the open front door. That much red luxon in the basement meant the whole thing could whoomp. The explosion made the floor jump beneath Karis's feet. It hit just as she was pushing off a step, and it flung her like a spring. The yawning open doors of the church yawned wider. She was lifted and thrown forward. For a moment she thought she would make it through them and be flung harmlessly outside, but she had been lifted high by the explosion. Too high. The ironwood frame above the door loomed. Then her upper body smashed into it and through it. The burned, weakened ironwood gave way after only an instant, but the instant it held was long enough for her to be spun viciously, upside down, flipping so fast she didn't even know how many times she tumbled. Then she was skidding on cobblestones and gravel, not sure if she had blacked out for a second, or exactly how she had come to the ground. She turned over, ignoring the just starting screams of protest from all too much of her body, and looked toward the mangled front door of the church. A gigantic crimson snake, all aflame, stabbed its head out of the front door. No, not a snake. A tube of pure red luxon, of fire, the width of a man's shoulders. Then the serpent vomited, and just a little faster than fire could curl up the flammable red luxon, the drafter was shot clear of the church, and fire and luxon alike. He landed not far from Karis, and far from gracefully, rolled to bleed off speed, and finally, standing. He scanned the streets on every side, and seeing no one, only then allowed him to relax a little. Once he did, Karis could see a bone-deep weariness steal over him. Drafting as much magic as she had just seen left him looking about as bad as she felt, deathly pale and tottering on his feet. "Come on," the drafter said. "I think Garadul's soldiers are all gone. But if not, they'll be here soon, after what you just did. We need to go." Karis stood, wobbled, and would have fallen if he hadn't grabbed her. "Who are you?" "I'm Corvin Danavis," the drafter said. "And if I don't misremember, you're Karis Whiteoak, aren't you?" "Danavis?" she asked. Orlum, how she heard. "You were Dazin's, a rebel. I can make it on my own, thank you." She shrugged off his help, leaned crazily to one side, and then the other, and finally collapsed. He watched, arms folded, and didn't catch her. Her shoulder hit the ground, and the world swam. Karis saw Corvin's boots come close. She's probably going to leave her here for the soldiers. She deserved it, too. Stupid, stubborn girl. "All right, get some sleep, my princess. I love you so much."